Welcome back. Pat the Sound Guy here again for round 2 of how to fix a weed eater. So I bet you're wondering, what did we do last time? In case you're wondering, you didn't see the other video. We opened up the intake to cover off the carburetor, and we sprayed a little bit of flammable liquid in there, and it ran no problem. So that told us we had compression, spark, and once we know that, and it runs, well, we know all we gotta do is repair the carburetor, and it should run okay. No problem. So, next question I bet you're about to ask is, well, what if it doesn't run when you put some gas or flammable liquid inside the carburetor? Next step, very simple. Let's check for spark. So we know this one does spark, but if it didn't fire up at that point, you know that, well, maybe you got a bad spark plug. So you can always try a new spark plug. They're fairly expensive, but I find these things, they generally don't foul up too bad, which is really weird, but anyway. So there's our spark plug. Plug your spark plug in. And take Mr. Spark Plug and you hold it down over. It's hard to see that. And you ground it out on the top of that cylinder, and you can pull it over, and if the switch is turned on, the key thing to the whole operation, you'll see spark. I'm seeing pretty good hot spark there. That's no problem. So, okay, say it still sparks. If it didn't spark, you might need a new coil, and that is something you can also look online. You can take the model number of your trim or whatever and dump it into your online portal of choice where you want to find parts, or your local shop. That might be a little more expensive, where that might cut into your budget to make it not worth fixing, but it's always worth a try to try the local guy first. Sometimes they might carry something inexpensive to fix it. So you don't have your spark, it could be your coil. That's the thing to check too. But if the spark plug is wet on the end of it, sometimes these guys, they sit and they get water in them or whatever inside the crankcase. This is the crankcase in here. So that's where the crank itself spins around. There's a counterweight on it. And this particular model is very simple to get in there, to kind of look in that crankcase, because it's just a plastic cover. There's an O-ring on there. So what I tend to do is you tend to take there's 4 screws, the torque on the front here. Come off there for the worst. Come off there. Come on. Put that screw back in a little bit and pull my tool off. There we go. So we'll take these 2 screws on the front that hold this back cover on. Make sure you double check the screws as you pull them out, because they can be different lengths. So it's a good idea to check them all the time. That one's also a little bit stuck in my tool here. There you go. So pull that out with a hand. I believe you only have to pull the top screws, 2 screws of the 4 to pull the back cover off. So there's 2. And then these 4 on the back. 1. 2. Now these are Allen head screws, but Honda Torx works just fine for them. We're not working on the space shuttle or the space station or whatever. Oh, 1 more screw back here on the top by the spark plug. And that screw is different because it's going into plastic, so it's a little more coarse thread. So put that one there so you know that's a little bit different screw. It's a separate. And this cover comes right off the back with the fuel tank attached. So there you go. Let's see if we can get you in there to have a look at that crankcase. And there you go. That's the crankcase in there. As you can see, there's a little needle bearing in there. little bit of residue in here and kind of a carbony buildup from junk or whatever gotten in there. Now, sometimes what can happen is this could be full of oil and fuel and sometimes moisture and water. So what you can do is you can tip her over, tip her back, and dump it out. And then spray a little bit of that brake cleaner, some of that carb cleaner in there, and then I blow it out with a little compressed air, and then put a little bit of two-stroke oil on that bearing there, and you're good to go. It's also an easy way to inspect, not have to take all the covers off to get to the muffler and take springs off and all that kind of stuff to pull that muffler off to look inside there. You can pull this over real gentle, and you can look up underneath with a flashlight in there, and you can see what's going on. So sometimes when they don't want to run and the spark plug keeps getting wet, we'll zoom you back out. Yeah, so the spark plug's wet every time you take it out and try and dry it off. You know, that can be an issue. So that could be what it is. It could be a buildup. The carburetor could have malfunctioned and just dumped a bunch of fuel down in there, and it could be all gunked up. I've actually repaired a few that had tons of water down in here, and it wasn't the prettiest looking thing, but it was fun. Once you sprayed it out, and then you just lubricated that bearing a little bit. So when you spray it out with some carb cleaner, brake cleaner, whatever, to try and dry it out or get all the junk out of there, that you got to replace the oil that come off of that bearing so it doesn't burn it up. Problem solved. Now, another word of advice on these trimmers: they're not rated to last all that long. Some of them are 25 hours, some are 50 hours. It depends on, these ones, the smaller ones, sometimes are 25 hours. Now, that being said, if you use good oil and you mix it right all the time, and don't forget the oil, that can happen. That can really trash something. That'll make it rendle it. You'd have to replace the top end, which sometimes you can buy the cylinder and piston rings, fairly inexpensive for some of these units, on the interwebs, on the inner screen, as Terrell says. And it would be worthwhile to pull a few bolts and bolt a whole new piston and rings in there, and new cylinder, and you'd be ready to go again for pretty cheap. But that's where you want to kind of weigh it out, the cost of a new one, basically cost of parts and your time, whatever. So that could be something you want to think about. So that might be another reason why it might not run, and it could be really frustrating because you keep pulling it over, and it might kind of want to start, but then all of a sudden you pull the spark plug and it's wet all the time. So that can be a common problem with a lot of two-strokes. You used to see that on two-stroke scooters. Sometimes the oil pump, the auto oiling system, would fail a little bit or would weep oil into the crankcase, and all of a sudden spark plug would always be wet. And so stuff like that happens. So now that's something that you can look at, and you say it only took a few screws, and if you look up in there and it's all scored, it's all messed up. Here, let's show you what a dead piston looks like when you forget to add oil. Where's the piston? Where's the piston? Where's my old piston? There it is. There's my old piston. So that's what it looks like when you either overheat it or you run it without oil. And that piston ring is just jammed in there real tight. See, so that's what you'd be looking for when you pull an exhaust or muffler or look up inside in there and you take that back cover off. That'd be why it wouldn't run. So that's things that can make it not run. But we've already tested and we know it runs. So give me a minute, I'll put these screws back in, put this back cover back on, and then we'll continue from there. Now, something else we want to check while we got this apart. It's the condition of our fuel lines and our primer line there. Now, that's pretty dried out and pretty hard. Now, that would work okay. There's no reason why we couldn't run that. There's no breathing at all. But while we've got it apart, if I have the fuel line here, which I know I do, we can repair that. We can put a new line in there just because this is hard as a rock and it'll seal better. And if you don't seal that up, the proper piece of fuel line that fits in the hole, then that could leak when you want to set it up on its end in the shed or the garage or whatever and leak fuel everywhere. So we don't want that. We don't want a fire hazard. So I'll go find the right fuel line and I'll be back. All right, so I figured while we got this fuel tank off of here, I wasn't really going to replace these fuel lines because they're still kind of pliable. But, if it leaks a little bit around this hole here, you could tip your trimmer up on its end in the shed and all the fuel might leak out. That could be a fire hazard. You just don't want that to leak all over the floor of your garage or whatever. So while we're here, I do have the fuel line. You can find this fuel line in little kits. A lot of times a hardware store, even Home Depot, will carry some little kits like this. This happens to be 3/32 inner diameter and 5/32 outer diameter. It seems to match up, the same size. So it'll fit through the hole nice and tight. It's new. There's different colors. So there's yellow, is it the Tygon kind of brand line? That's good for fuel. This is Stens This is Stens True Blue fuel line, and this is also meant for fuel. And you can't use the clear fuel line that's meant for your fish tank. That won't work. That will harden up in about a day with contact with fuel. And so what you do is you get yourself a piece of wire, maybe a pair of needle nose pliers. That might help. It's long like that if you've got them. If you don't, this works just fine. A piece of wire with a little hook fashion on the end. And you can fish that little fuel filter out. Now, something I also did before I took this off, this tank assembly off, is I made sure to note what line went to what fitting on the carburetor. So this is the filter, and this goes to the fuel inlet of the carburetor, which was straight up, and this went to under the primer bulb, which came out on an angle. So I had to double check and make sure, I make sure you know where the lines come from and go back. Draw a little diagram on a piece of paper, whatever you got to do. Take a picture, where they got to go. Even a video is good. That way you don't put it back together backwards and have trouble later on and not having it run. So that fuel filter looks like it might still be okay, but it's crusty. So if you can get your hands on another filter, that's just another thing you don't have to troubleshoot later when it doesn't want to flow fuel. So I've got replacement inexpensive fuel filter. They have a little weight on the end. This has a little weight on the end of that one, so it stays put in the tank. So we're going to put that on the end of the piece of fuel line and then fish that through. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take this fuel line and pull it through. I kind of measured it before I took it apart. I measure, so I have a little extra fuel line. If you use a little extra, they give you quite a bit in those kits, so you know. So next thing we want to do is make a pair of scissors or a knife, a little razor knife or something, and make a nice kind of slivery point on the end of this fuel line. And that makes it easier to get it through the hole, so to speak. There we go. So cut her on a point, whatever you got to do to get it in the hole. That seems to be good. Now what you can do, I seem to be making an okay seal in there. Definitely decent seal. Now we can take a piece of wire or take whatever, and we can put that filter on the end of it. Cut that off flush. And I kind of made sure I looked before I took the filter out of there how deep it was in the tank, so we know it was down in here somewhere. We'll put it back in there. So it's a little bit bigger on my fuel filter than the original one was. So there's a little trick: hair dryer or a heat gun, one or the other. A little bit warm so I don't melt the heck out of it, but we'll heat it up just slightly. That'll go on a bigger fitting, and it'll all be good. So let's just heat it up just a little bit, not too hot. And we can slide that down over that fitting. And it'll stay there forever. It won't pop off on its own. That's a good thing. And center it up on there. So there you go. That goes on there. And what we'll do is we'll just pull a bunch of fuel line out. Push it back in there. Take a piece of wire and make sure that's sitting at the bottom of the tank right. Yeah, geez, I got that just right on the money there. That's right down in that bottom part of the tank on the other end, so it'll pick up the fuel pretty much no matter where you are. So there's that one. And we'll do this one next. Yeah. We'll push that down through there. Get our little hook. And this is the same thing. Get it through, hook it with the piece of wire. It may seem like a lot of work for something that you might think you might want to just go buy a new one. But like I said before, if it's expensive, you know, why waste money when something's going to run again? Because this could run another 10 years. This machine, my customer, he said, oh, geez, I hardly ever run this. And now it won't run. So, it's worth it to fix it. Like I said, I'm an independent guy. I'm not a huge shop. I don't have huge overhead. I should just cut that slit in that first and put that in through the hole first. There we go. Cut a little slot. Cut a little tip off again, so it's nice and sharp to go through the hole. This one's fairly easy again. We just pull that down through the hole. Geez, that works good. Take our hook and hook it. Just push a little bit more. Let's see what we're doing here. Push this down here like this. Snip the end off. And put that on there again. This is the return line from the primer bulb when you prime it, so it puts the fuel back in the tank. Here you go. Push it all the way on there, and then pull that back up like that. And that was up inside the tank right there, like so. Ta-da! So, double check that fuel filter. That's a little bit too far up there. There we go. Well, if you want to twist it a little bit, just to make sure that that filter sits right at the bottom of the tank. Can you see that? See, we can shine the flashlight in there, you can see that. You can see it down the bottom of the tank. It's right down in here. Right down underneath there. So now we have fresh fuel lines. We've got this ready to go. We can put this back together. So we'll come back in a minute and I'll pop that back on there and we'll go again. Alright, so I've gone ahead and reinstalled the fuel tank, the back cover, and I've taken the liberty of taking the carburetor air cleaner cover off, and the little metal plate that keeps the air filter from getting sucked into the intake of the carburetor. Also 2 torque screws. So now we're going to pull the carburetor off of here. Same thing, another couple of those torque screws. Well, they're Allen heads, but this torque bit works perfectly well in those as well, if you don't have anything else. So what we do is we pull the little control cable off, and be careful not to lose our wonderful little gasket. So this is a very important little gasket, and you can see how it's orientated by the lines that are squished in it. This gasket was put on that way. There's a couple of locating tabs on there. So you want to make sure that this goes back on the right way. You can't really screw it up, but it's where it's already been on there for so long. You want to make sure that those indentations go back where they came from. Because there is 2 holes in there to match up if you get it flipped up. So this pulse line that runs the fuel pump in the carburetor, it'll work either direction. Anyway, here we go. Carburetor. So next, we're going to take this carburetor and open it up and have a look. Because this is where most of the problems happen, is in the little carburetor. Most of the time, when I see on the forums, on the Facebook pages, everybody says, oh, just buy a new carburetor, buy a new carburetor. Or somebody asks, oh, my trimmer won't rev up and it just idles and it won't do anything else. What do I do? People say, get a new carburetor or clean the carb. That's not very helpful because cleaning this won't solve the problem. Very rarely do these trimmers ever get enough junk in the fuel tank. Some of these get very rarely used. And that's what usually the problem lies, is right here in this carburetor. Now, the trick is, what you do is you look at this carburetor, it says Zama on it. Some of them say Walbro, some of them don't say anything. When they don't say anything, that can be a little tougher to find what you're looking for. But what you got to do is, while I'm taking this apart, I'll show you. This says W7C on it, and it's a Zama. So you go to the Zama website, type in that W7C, and that'll tell you what carb kit and diaphragm kit you need for this little guy. So, here you go. Time and time again, what happens is, everybody asks that question, why won't my trimmer rev? And it says, clean the carburetor, or they say, I've cleaned the carburetor 5 times and it still won't work. Well, take a little razor knife and you can pull this. This is called the metering diaphragm. So what this does is this is what keeps the carburetor from overflowing with fuel. And this little guy is supposed to be floppy. As you can see, it's not. It's quite hard. It's a little supple, but not soft enough to really return properly and push that up and down. And there's the needle. And I tend not to replace these needles. I find very rarely is there ever a problem with them. So if you're not too savvy with one of these carburetors, that might be the way to go. It's just leave that needle and stuff installed. And don't even worry about it. Because there's usually very rarely a problem with this. If this ran before, it ran fine, why mess with it? So it's very rarely going to go bad. So there's your problem right there. And if you notice, the way the gasket goes on first. Diaphragm goes on second, and that lines up sort of like that on there. So let's go through, dig up the pile and see if I can find the right carb kit for this guy. Before we do that, we'll take this off here. That's the primer bulb. And quite often you can get away with just replacing that diaphragm. So that little diaphragm, you can actually order those separately sometimes. You can buy them in a bag full of them for a couple of bucks from wherever. I order the Walbro style right from Walbro. I order these diaphragms separately in a little bag full of them. They're about half a dozen at a time. And the gaskets, the standard gaskets that I see most often on most equipment. And there you go. There's your fuel pump. Now there is a little bit of scuzz and junk in there, but we'll clean that out with some brake clean. Brake clean works fine to clean these up. And there's your diaphragm there for the fuel pump. So we'll clean that all up and we'll clean this carburetor out. You can see there is a little bit of junk in there, a little bit of buildup in there on that screen. We can pull that screen out in a minute with the sometimes use the edge of my little razor knife to pull that out, or something tiny like that. And we'll pull that screen out, and we'll make sure the screen passes the any cleaner we ever put through it, so we know it's clear. Because sometimes they varnish up, and they will look clean, but they won't pass any fuel. So next, we're going to take the brake parts cleaner and just hose it off. Hose it off outside. Now you want to stay away from blasting these suckers with a ton of compressed air, because you can actually ruin them doing that. Clean her all off. Clean it. Spray through all the passages. It's good if you have a little nozzle in it, but it is what it is. Now, sometimes these carburetors will not be, it won't be able to clean them just because they get too gummed up inside, and then that way you can soak them. Sometimes I've soaked these kind of carburetors, or any carburetor in general, in something like Simple Green for pressure washers, or all-purpose cleaner, or something like that, and soaked it for a few hours or even overnight, just to dissolve some of the goop that builds up over time. Take our screwdriver. And there actually is, in the Carb Rebuild kit, uses a new screen, so we might be able to just put a new screen in this. To make sure that that's clear. Yep, that's taking the cleaner through it, so we'll just pop it out and make sure there's nothing underneath it. Chainsaws, they love to get junk up underneath these screens. If you don't have a new screen and you're scared about messing it up, you can leave it in there. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave it in there for now until I go find the carb kit. That's got to flow through it. And there you go, little spooge there too. So a quick internet search told me that a RB73 from Zama is the rebuild kit for this carburetor. So it's got everything you need, needles and all, everything right in there. But I'm not going to replace the needles because I don't think we need to. There's even a new primer bulb in there, so we'll replace that at the same time. Why the heck not? We get all the parts. There's a new screen there too. And then we have the gasket for the fuel pump diaphragm. And there's our fuel pump diaphragm right there. We'll pop that into there, that screen. So, gasket on first. And diaphragm on second. And if this had been running really erratically before this diaphragm got hard, I would be adjusting this lever. But where it ran right before, I'm not going to worry about it because you're not going to have the tool for that at home. Even though a lot of the times it's just flat with the body of the carburetor and a lot of those. But if you don't have the tool, don't be messing with it. It's probably fine. That's why I don't recommend you replace that if you don't have to. Because why mess with something you don't have to? Yeah, put that little screen on there. Center it in the hole. And I use the back end of this screwdriver to drive it home. Fits just great, and that tucks it right down in there, and Bob's your uncle. Now, sometimes what I will do is line up where that came from. That diaphragm. Nope. There you go. That lines it up there. Now, another trick. A little WD-40 or a little carb cleaner. Or a little two-stroke coil. That'll work too. And that keeps that from dancing around on there for you. Just like that. That's your idle adjustment screws, so that goes up that way. Couple of screws. After you put your primer bulb on. Ta-da! There you go. Fully rebuilt carburetor. So that wasn't very hard now, was it? So next step, we'll reinstall it on the machine. So now we're back to the body of the trimmer. We've got our gasket that goes between the carburetor and this insulator section here. And as you can see, there's a notch here and a notch here. There's little pokey out tabs on here and here. And you can see this has a little bit of a circle there. This came off like this. And this will make sure you don't have a leak. Next step, we grab our cover. Cover with the bolts in it. We grab our carburetor. And what we do is we make sure we orientate our carburetor correctly, which is like this. And we stick our control cable back where it goes. Carburetor lines up on there like that. Little stepped washer in there. You gotta make sure it goes back in its hole in the choke. So make sure we get this orientated correctly. We'll put our boot bolt through. Push it on there. Put that little control cable back in its hole. These are very simple machines. One of the most simple kind of engines you can ever see. There isn't much to them, so repairing them isn't too difficult. All right. Now I use my impact because I do it all the time, but I recommend you do it by hand, of course, just to make sure you don't strip something out. And I will finish it off by hand. Get it up just snug. The choke should work still. There we go. So now the next step, we'll put our fuel lines back on and we'll cut them to length. All right, we're all set up here. So here's our primer line, and it had a little bit of a crook in it. You can see that. It had a little bit of a bend in it. No, I'll just cut her off there. And the main fuel line, we know we want a little bit of a bend in it. And snip her off. All right, there we go. Good to go. So before we get too much further, let's go put some fuel in it. We'll be right back. All right, so I took the liberty of putting the thing back together. I put a new air filter element in here. Put all our screws back. I put our 2 screws in the front here, our screw in the back here for the cover, these 4 screws in. And pretty much it started and ran. I pulled the cord. After priming a little bit, it ran. Now, there was a little thing I missed. Inside the fuel tank, this primer line has a little fitting in there that we put back on. It needs a second piece of fuel line to go down inside the tank to suck up to prime. So that was something I forgot about. Well, it was missing. So we replaced it. Other than that, a little bit of adjustment. Now, some of these carburetors do not have any adjustments on them anymore. They don't have them. This guy does. So you've got a high-speed adjustment right there. And I opened that up just a little bit, to give a little bit more fuel on full top end. Other than that, we have a perfectly working trimmer. I gave a little bit of oil down in here. And other than that, we have a perfectly working trimmer. So here you go. Primed it a few times, put the choke on. So the name of the game is to adjust that screw out enough so it just growls a little bit when you're at full throttle, and then you're good. So there you have it. Another job, all done. All the screws went back where they came from. New air filter, fuel in the tank, new fuel lines, inexpensive carb kit. Another one saved from the trash. You can do it too. So remember, drop a comment down below. Don't forget to subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one. Rock on.